Have you ever wondered why an idea that promised to liberate workers ended up building walls? It all starts with a simple, powerful question from the 19th century. If labor creates all value, why do workers own nothing? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels tried to answer this in their Communist Manifesto. Their solution? Abolish private property. Not your toothbrush, but the factories, the land, the machines. Everything used for production would belong to everyone, or really, to no one. It wasn't a policy, it was a prophecy. And in 1917, that prophecy became a plan. As World War I raged, Lenin and his Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. Their slogan was irresistible: peace, land, and bread. Within a year, they started collecting the receipts for their revolution. State decrees nationalized everything: factories, banks, railways. Imagine an entire country's economy being folded up and put into the government's pocket. The dream of a classless society was being built, one confiscated asset at a time. By the 1930s, under Joseph Stalin, ideology had turned into arithmetic. The famous 5-year plans were not economic forecasts, they were commands from the top. Soviet planners in Moscow decided everything. Every ton of steel to be forged, every acre of wheat to be sown, every pair of boots to be stitched. It all had a quota. Official reports from Gosplan, the state planning committee, showed production charts rocketing upward. On paper, the Soviet Union was an industrial miracle. But paper can't feed you. This is where economics crashes the party. A huge debate kicked off in academic journals, asking a deceptively simple question. Can you actually run a modern economy without prices? Prices, after all, are signals. They tell you what's scarce, what's abundant, what people want. Without them, how do you know whether to make more tractors or more bread? The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises argued it was impossible. You'd be flying blind. Others, like Oscar Lange, were more optimistic, believing they could invent a formula to replace the market. By 1936, that formula looked like a mess of complex equations that couldn't solve a simple problem. There wasn't enough food. Stalin's own archives reveal a system drowning in misallocations and shortages. There was a kind of bureaucratic optimism that could move mountains of paperwork, but couldn't get flour to a bakery on time. It was a system that could plan everything except for reality. And the centralization didn't stop with the economy. It extended to belief itself. The Soviet regime launched a full-scale war on religion, promoting a scientific worldview that was, ironically, held with religious fervor. A 1929 decree officially declared atheism to be state science. Churches were shut down, their property confiscated, and many were turned into museums of disbelief. The message was clear. In this new world, even your soul belonged to the state. If you wanted to believe in heaven, you'd need a permit. After World War II, this model went global. Communism was exported through institutions like Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. It was the Eastern Bloc's answer to a common market. Official documents show members coordinating everything: prices, quotas, trade in coal, tractors, you name it. On paper, it was a perfectly synchronized dance of socialist economies. In reality, it was more like a dysfunctional family argument. By the late 1980s, reports sent back to Moscow were admitting to technological backwardness and chronic inefficiency. That's bureaucratese for "this whole thing is falling apart." Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Washington was watching and reading. Declassified documents like NSC 68, written in 1950, reveal America's view of the Soviet Union. It was seen as a slave state bent on world domination, but also as a serious economic competitor. The Cold War wasn't just about spies and missiles, it was a battle of systems. America's countermove was capitalism, but with its own mountain of paperwork, the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, the creation of the IMF, and a strategy to outgrow the Soviet economy. President Truman called it supporting free peoples. Stalin called it imperialism with better lighting. As it turns out, both were kind of right. Let's give credit where it's due. By the numbers, communism industrialized nations at a mind-boggling speed. In just 30 years, Russia went from a near-feudal society to a nuclear superpower. That is an unprecedented leap. But this progress came with a staggering price tag. World Bank data tells a clear story. By 1990, the average income per person in the Soviet Union was less than half of that in the United States. The problem wasn't a lack of effort. Soviet citizens worked incredibly hard. The problem was a lack of feedback. In a system where pointing out a mistake can be seen as an act of treason, bad ideas don't get corrected. They get enshrined in the next 5-year plan. But communism wasn't just one story. In China, the same ideology took a very different path. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s was a catastrophic attempt to rapidly industrialize the country. It resulted in a famine so vast and devastating that historical archives struggle to even calculate the human cost. It was a tragedy born from the same top-down command and control thinking. However, after Mao's death, something remarkable happened. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping ushered in a new era of reform and opening up. He famously said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." This was a radical departure. China didn't abandon communism overnight, but it began to introduce market mechanisms. Farmers could sell their surplus crops. Special economic zones were created to attract foreign investment. What happened next was one of the greatest economic transformations in human history. Millions were lifted out of poverty as China became the world's factory. It's a hybrid system, what some call state capitalism. The Communist Party is still in absolute control, but it allows the market to do what it does best: allocate resources and create wealth. This raises a fascinating question. Is this still communism? Or is it something entirely new, a system that Marx himself would never have recognized? So, we return to that original question. Why did an idea meant to empower the worker so often lead to oppression? The history we've walked through suggests an answer. When you centralize all power, economic, political, and even spiritual, in the hands of the state, you eliminate the very feedback loops that allow a society to adapt and correct its own mistakes. Without prices, you don't know what to produce. Without free speech, you don't know when you're wrong. And without private property, there's no buffer between the individual and the total power of the state. The story of communism is a grand, often tragic, experiment in human organization. It shows us that good intentions aren't enough, and that the simplest questions, like who owns what, can have the most complex and profound consequences. It's a reminder that no single formula, no matter how brilliant, can capture the messy, unpredictable, and vibrant reality of human society. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the ideas that shape our world. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next video.